Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Shelley Haven. I'm an assistive technology specialist, consultant, whatever word you want to use. And so anyway, we've got a lot to cover here today. I got to tell you in advance, the most difficult part of putting together these presentations is deciding what not to include because there's so much stuff out there. So I'm going to move on to the second slide here. Just to give you a little bit about, so you know who I am and why I'm talking about this. Anyway, as I mentioned, I'm an assistive technology specialist. I work, the name of my business, consulting business, is Technology to Unlock Potential, otherwise known as Tech Potential. And if you like, you can go to my website and learn more. Anyway, I've worked with just about every age group and every type of disability during my roughly 27 years working in AT, but my focus for the last several years has been technology for learning and executive functions, and you can see a list of the sort of things that I do, including all the way from assessment through integration in the classroom, and of course workshops and also online consulting and tech assistance for people who need it. And at least for folks in the Bay Area, I consider myself a traveling assistive technology resource center, so I always go to the home or the school. So let me move on to the next slide here. And this is just kind of a general list to give you an idea of the sorts of problems that we'll be talking about during today's session. These are problems with productivity. So, you know, this could apply to students, it could apply to young kids, it could apply to adults. Although some of these examples are obviously students. You know, Jenna comes home with a ton of homework to do, stares at her binder, has no idea where to start. Hank has a lot of great ideas, but when he puts it into his written work, the written work is just very disorganized, it's not cohesive. Sarah is a high school student, and she has difficulty listening and taking notes at the same time, so she's often has a choice between I can do one or the other, but I can't do both. Alex has been doing all sorts of things this morning before school and doesn't realize that, oh my gosh, 30 minutes have passed and the bus is here and I'm not even dressed yet. Priya is very careful to write down all the important information that she needs, whether it's, telephone numbers or assignments from class, but then she can't find that information later. And Jerry works very hard, is always busy, but for some reason, where does the time go? He doesn't have a lot of time. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. All these people have something in common, and they're dealing with challenges in the executive functions area. You'll see all sorts of definitions online, so I've picked something just kind of short and sweet here. Is you can think of executive functions as the mental processes that you use to manage yourself and manage your resources in order to achieve a goal, okay, in order to get something done. And all these processes take place in the frontal lobe of the brain. And so you can think about it as being kind of like your cognitive manager for everything that you do. And there might be a number of reasons why a person has executive function challenges. For one thing, the frontal lobe of the brain develops a lot. It's one of the last parts of the brain to develop. So, kids generally are going to have more problems like this than teens or adults would. So with some students, that part of the brain may just develop a little bit more slowly, just like every other part of the body. People develop at different rates, and maybe when they're older, the executive functions kind of kick in more. With some people, that part of the brain never really fully matures, so they may be dealing with executive function challenges for a long time. Other thing is that there might be, injury to the frontal lobe of the brain that can also cause problems with dealing with executive functions. As you saw from the previous page, that these were not learning challenges. These are not learning disabilities. These are what would probably better be called producing challenges, the ability to marshal your learning skills and talents and knowledge and abilities in order to actually produce something. They're not related to intelligence at all. And I work with a lot of students who are extremely intelligent, but they just can't marshal those resources to actually be able to demonstrate it. The other thing is that we're talking about multiple functions, and that's why when we talk about executive functioning, it's plural, executive functions, and we'll be talking about what those different functions are shortly. And the solutions you decide on, like any other technology that we're working with, let's say for learning challenges, it depends on the specific nature of the challenge, what the task is, and also the environment or context in which the individual is performing that task. So moving to the next slide. So one way to kind of give you a better feel for executive function challenges is to offer some common analogies that are used. Like the name implies, executive function, it's the executive in your brain. You might say, well, it's kind of like the CEO of a company. Because there are a number of different executive functions in play here, it might be better to actually say it's an executive management team, all right? Another analogy that is a good one is an orchestra conductor that has all the very talented musicians in the orchestra, and the conductor is coordinating all their actions. Now it's kind of analogous to the CEO of a company, but I mainly put that analogy in there because it gives me an excellent opportunity to show you the next slide, which gives a really good visual on what it feels like to have executive function challenges. This is a picture of an orchestra being conducted by one of those balloon men that you see at used car dealerships that are just kind of blowing all around and waving their arms. Sometimes that's what it feels like. Trying to pull everything together, and that you're being conducted by a balloon man. So I'm going to go back to the previous slide now, slide number 7. And excuse me, slide number 5. Sorry. Anyway, saying that the executive functions are like the coaching staff of a football team is actually a pretty good analogy, because there are multiple coaches that do multiple things, offensive coordinator, defensive team coordinator, etc. And you analyze the situation, strategize a plan, execute that plan, evaluate the results, and make changes. So that's kind of a good analogy to what the executive functions are doing. The last one I kind of like is the idea of manually flying the plane versus on autopilot. A lot of these executive functions, as we'll see, whether it's planning or organizing or using your working memory, most of the time, most people don't think about what's actually going on in their head. They just do it, all right? So it's like flying your plane on autopilot. For individuals who have executive function problems, they'll need to fly the plane manually. So there's two important takeaways from this point here. Number one, it doesn't mean you can't fly the plane. It just means you need to do certain things out in the real world as opposed to in your head. And you can fly the plane just fine. It might take a little bit extra effort. But the second point is the fact that by putting those systems and those strategies and such into place early, when you get to middle school, high school, college, into adult life, no one ever flies their plane on autopilot all the time. I mean, like for instance, if you have to go to the grocery store and you only have to get 3 items, you'll hold that information in your working memory and until you get to the store. But if you have to get 20 items, what do? You make a list. You externalize what would be in your working memory and you put it on a piece of paper and carry it with you. So I have one student I was working with recently. I'd been working for the last year, and she has all these systems in place now. And she just transferred to a new school. She's in high school, and her teachers are amazed at how organized and how easily she's able to plan, because she has put all those systems in place early on. And like I said, everyone has to fly the plane manually sometimes. So moving to the next slide. That was my balloon man, so I'll go on to the next one here. So what are these functions? This in the next slide, I have 2 tables, 4 items each, showing, and this is, you'll get different answers from different people as to what the executive functions are. This is my way of grouping them that allows me to kind of comfortably organize my solution. So you may get different answers depending on who you talk to, but this is roughly what they are. So the first one is activation, the idea of getting, how do I get started, maintain my effort and persevere, and then finish the job. So that's called activation. The second one is attention. This is a little different from ADHD type attention. This is the ability to purposefully choose what you want to attend to and then to shift your focus and shift back as needed. When we talk about ADHD attention, that is your capacity for attention. There's obviously a big overlap here, and I realize in some people's minds they'll generically refer to a lot of the things I'm talking about here as ADHD. But ADHD and executive function issues, although they often appear together, and matter of fact in most people they'll appear together, they're actually 2 separate things. So that may be a moot point if you're having a problem with attention, but anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up. The third one is working memory and retrieval from memory. So this is the ability, this is where a lot of the processing goes on in your head. Think of it as the RAM in your computer, your mental computer, where you're holding a number of pieces of information, manipulating them, organizing them, maybe sequencing them, pulling information from memory, deciding what to do. You can think of it as your kind of your mental desktop, where you have a bunch of information and you're moving it around, grouping things together, trying to make sense of it, and then decide on an action. And in the process, you're also retrieving information from memory. And this is also where processing speed issues take place, because if your working memory is fine, but it's moving very slowly, that can create problems too. So that's really a huge area. Next one is organization. This is the organization of your materials and information, whether it's in the real world or in your mind, so that you can retrieve that information when you need it. It also is organizing your workspace, although I'm not actually going to talk about that during today's session. All right, so the second group of 4 here is planning. The idea of, and this involves working memory also, is prioritizing and sequencing your actions and anticipating outcomes if you make one decision versus another. An important part of planning is your awareness of time, your ability to estimate how long something's going to take and obviously do it accurately, and also your awareness of time passage. It's been said of people with executive function challenges that have a poor sense of time is that there are only 2 times. There's now and there's not now. So there's now, what I'm working on at the moment, and if I have an algebra assignment due tomorrow and a science or social studies assignment due a month from now, they're both in the same period. They're both due not now, and there's no distinction between them. So that can obviously create problems with regard to prioritizing. The next to last one here I've got is self-regulation, and obviously there's a huge overlap with the ADHD, inhibition, controlling impulses and emotions, and then finally self-monitoring as well. Self-monitoring is evaluating all these different things, see how I'm doing, do I need to make any changes, and making adjustments as necessary. So let me move on. So before we move on to different solutions, I want to give you some good news and some bad news. We're looking at this forlorn-looking kid staring over a blank piece of paper. The bad news is that technology alone is not going to fix any of these problems. The good news, though, is that when you couple the technology with thoughtfully selected strategies, the technology can make a huge difference. So this is really a case where technology and strategies need to work in concert with each other in order to affect results. So what we'll be looking for is, what are the technologies to support or enhance best practice strategies? All right, going on to the next slide. So this is a list of, you'll hear me mention these things many times during the rest of the presentation. These are the basic executive functioning supports or strategies. Probably the biggest one, and that's why the main one, that's why I've highlighted it or bold-faced it at the top, is externalize, is to take all those processes that are taking place in the head and to put them out in the real world. It could be on a piece of paper, it could be on a computer screen. It doesn't matter. We need to get those processes out of the head and in front of me where I can manipulate, whether it's time, tasks, information, whatever. Kind of along those lines is to make things that are not concrete visual or tangible. This could be math concepts with math manipulatives. It could be the idea of making time, which is an abstract concept, making that very tangible and visual. Breaking large things into smaller parts. This is especially true with regard to big projects. Breaking them into smaller, more manageable parts. Imposing a structure or a framework or a routine on those different things. So not only have we broken them into parts, but we've sequenced them and provided a framework around it. This is especially important with regard to writing, but also with regard to, here are the things I need to do before going to school in the morning. Being explicit, the best way I can describe that is, if I go and tell my child, clean your room, what does that really mean? Where do I start? Being explicit would be breaking it down and saying, all right, first I want you to pick up your clothes, you're going to put them in the hamper. Second, you're going to go to your desk, you're going to take all your papers from last week and do such and such. So that's being explicit and breaking it down. The sixth of the 7 strategies is providing these strategies and models and teaching it to the individual. So this is not, you don't want to just give somebody a planner and say, all right, now you should be able to plan. You have to teach the person how to use that, how to structure things, how to follow that routine. And then gradually, and this is the 7th point, is as they begin to internalize those strategies externally, now you can start to remove the supports. All right? So moving to the next slide. This is my typical technology iceberg slide, which is just there to point out, it's a kind of a crude drawing of an iceberg, mostly below the water, to point out that any of the stuff that we're talking about today, we're only going to be talking about a very small piece of that, and there's a lot more to it. I'm just bringing up some examples, and I must say I've kind of jam-packed this whole thing with examples. So we'll see how far we get on a lot of these. You can go to my website for other information. There's many other websites out there that have lots of tools listed as well. So, let's start out with activation and activation and attention. So I've grouped those two things together. The key strategies that we want to work with here is to establish a routine and to break things into smaller parts. And the reason you want to do that is because it's, if I give, and I've got a good example of this later when we get to planning and prioritizing, is that if I give you a 1-month-long project to do, it's not obvious where to start. But if I break it down and I sequence it, now you're able to get started. Now you're able to activate because you're only needing to do one small thing at a time, which is much more manageable. It's also easy to get off task. So managing distractions is an important part of that as well. Providing prompts to keep you on task. I'll explain that in the next couple of slides. And then also incorporating movement and breaks into what you're doing. This also is a big overlap between some of these and just typical ADHD type staying on task problems. So the technology that I'm going to be talking about here is like countdown timers with visual, auditory, and tactile feedback. Visual checklists, I'm just going to mention that right now. The idea of when you get off task, it's very helpful to come back to a checklist and say, okay, where was I? What's the thing I need to do next? All right, and by attaching it, making a visual component to it, makes it easier to get back on task as well. I'm going to show you an example of something called an assignment calculator, and then talk a little bit about what was I going to say about distraction reducers as well. So I'm on the next slide here. Procrastination and timers. I've listed on the top here something called Parkinson's third law, which is the fact that work expands to fill the allotted time for completion. So if a student has extended time to complete a project or extended time in class, but isn't told how to make use of that time, it doesn't make any difference. If I give the student double time to complete something, but they still don't know how to get started in the first place, I now have double time to still not be able to get something done. So what we want to do is we want to break down the task into smaller discrete parts, and 10 minutes or so is actually a pretty good idea of how to do that. And then estimate how much time it's going to take for each of these different parts, and then attempt to race the clock. When I say break them down into discrete parts of 10 minutes or so, we're talking really small parts. Like, I'm going to read the assignment, I'm going to make sure I understand it. I mean, that possibly is a 10-minute task. Some kids, not everybody, but some people do much better, putting on a timer, racing the clock, and then taking a short break and moving on. What I just described there is something that is commonly referred to as a procrastination hack. It's essentially forcing yourself to get going on something, and when you get going on something, it's easier to keep going. I've listed a website there for the procrastination hack. And by the way, that particular website, which is 43, I probably want to put on this little pointer here they give you in Blackboard, so I can point to things. There we go. This website here, if you go to 43folders.com, and this is especially for like high school or college students, there's some really good suggestions there on just trying to be more productive with your time. There's even an app called the 10+2 × 5 procrastination hack. So it's the idea of work for 10 minutes, take a 2-minute break, do this 5 times for an hour. That's actually what that means. All right, so let's move on to visual and auditory prompts. Sometimes just the idea of reminding me visually or auditorily where I am in the task can help. So the idea of having a visual timer, so I've shown a picture of, this is a kind of a screenshot of the time timer. You can look that up. There are apps for computers, there are apps for iPhones, Android devices, and you can also get a physical time timer that does this. There's also kind of free versions that you could probably look up. Another one is called Time Tracker. Time Tracker is this dandy looking little device on the lower right here that has a red light on the top, yellow light in the middle, and green light on the bottom, and you set it for different tasks so that a person can get a visual indication of, hey, I've got plenty of time left. Then it turns to yellow and it beeps and says, you better start wrapping it up, we're running out of time. And then red means you've now run out of time, you need to finish now. Another tool that can also be helpful is a watch with a silent alarm, a watch with a vibrating silent alarm. This can be used to just remind you, am I on task? So in other words, the idea of having a watch that vibrates silently and just kind of reminds you, kicks you back in from getting zoned out and saying, oh, am I on task? I need to get back on task. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So I'm going to show you an assignment calculator. This is a tool. It's an online web reference, and the easiest way for me to show this to you, it's something that can be used to break down a large project into smaller tasks, kind of generic, and it's used at universities and also in high school. So I'm going to go to, so you're going to see a pause here. It's called Research Project Calculator. So this is a web tool, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in an assignment. So I'm just going to say project for the moment. And it starts today and it ends 2 months from today, and it's for my English class. I'll just type that in. And it's a writing assignment. And then I'm going to say create an assignment for me. What I did was I dialed in, you know, here's how long I have for the task. And what it does is, you can see on the side here, the very tiny thing. Yes, somebody wrote on the side, technology is a two-edged sword. It both helps and hinders. Yes, technology can be a barrier. So anyway, what it does is it breaks a typical writing assignment, because I asked for a writing assignment, down into specific parts, saying like, okay, you need to understand your assignment by this date. Then you need to do this by this date. Then you need to do this by this date. And it helps to provide some sort of a framework and a sequence for that task. Now, not so much suggesting that you should all go to that website, but rather to create a template for yourself in Word or Pages or Inspiration where you can do that same sort of thing yourself. So that was the main reason for me showing that, or not showing it, as the case may be. All right, so I'm going to move along quickly here to minimizing distractions. And let's see, so one of the easiest things from the standpoint of minimizing visual distractions is to only look at one application on the screen of your computer. There's a couple of very simple commands you can use for a Mac or Windows to just say, just show me the front app and hide everything else. If you want something a little more robust, I suggest going to these two apps I've mentioned here. Easiest thing to do is just Google them. One is called Isolator for Mac, Ghoster for Windows. And what it does, it provides you with a number of tools for fading out or blurring everything in the background, including the taskbar, the dock, etc., and just showing the front-based window. It's kind of impressive that when you only are looking at one thing on the screen, it's so much easier to visually concentrate on something. Next slide. Okay, so other distraction reducers, and I'll let you explore these on your own. I've put a website like readability.com when it might be, you know, confusing as to where to find these things. The other ones I suggest, it's easy enough to just Google them. Some of them are listed on my website under the AT Toolbox as well. Readability.com has the capability of reformatting web pages and removing images, which could be visual distractors. All browsers have the ability to hide all images, and the commands vary by the browser, but knowing that it's there, you can look for it. AdBlock is an extension that can be added to the most popular browsers. All browsers have the ability to add extensions or certain functionality, and AdBlock is by far the most popular extension for all browsers. Why? Because it blocks the ads, which can always be distractors. Next one, kind of obvious, take email offline, turn off the phone. If you're having a problem with auditory distractions, look into using the white noise app. It's on mobile devices, you know, smartphones, also on computers, or just listening to instrumental music and headphones to kind of blot out everything else. Lastly, if you need something a little bit more robust to keep you from tuning into websites that are distracting or such like that, you can invoke Leech Block for Firefox, or if you're on a Mac, a little free program called Self-Control. You can Google those as well. What they do is they will block access to websites that you say, these are my distracting websites, and it will not allow you to go to them no matter what. You'd have to reboot the computer in order to regain control of it. So be careful how you use it. All right, next slide. So let's go on to working memory. Working memory is a really big area. Working memory, again, this is where all the processing takes place in your brain. And so the main strategy that you want to use is to take all that stuff out of your head and put it out in front of you. You could do this on paper. You can do this, you know, on various computer programs. You want to make those things visual and to try to provide an external structure in that, you know, external environment. Again, whether it's on paper or on the computer. From the standpoint of retrieving information, it's also helpful to have what I like to think of as an external brain. So we can use things like word banks would be an example of an external brain, where I have a list of words or phrases I can use, transition phrases, let's say, and just have that to refer to rather than pulling it up out of my head. Same thing with math formulas or any other quick access information you need. So we mentioned visual checklists before. I'll just leave that alone for the moment. I'm going to say something about digital cameras. I'm going to show you a few examples with the graphic organizer, and then we're going to talk a little bit about note-taking. So let me move on to the next slide. Okay, so a camera is a wonderful tool for addressing working memory problems. Why? Because taking a picture of something is way easier and way more accurate than trying to copy it. So if you need to remember what the homework assignment is, or you know, something that's written on a whiteboard at work or whatever, snap a picture of it, and then usually have a place to put it, like whether it's in a digital notebook or a file you keep on the computer. You can take pictures of experiment setups, a reference page from a textbook, so you can keep going back and forth to that. Picture of your parking space, so you remember where that is. But it's pictures, digital cameras can be wonderful for that. And then if you need to store it for a longer period of time, obviously drop it into a digital notebook or an email to yourself or a reminder to-do apps, which we will get to in a little bit. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit into graphic organizers, and I know many of you are familiar with you know, that term graphic organizer is used a lot with regard to writing, and usually it refers to a static framework into which, let's say I'm writing a 3-paragraph essay and I'm dropping information into a framework that maybe the teacher has set up. But it's static. Most people use graphic organizers as, you know, it could be a piece of paper with that framework and I'm dropping information into it. Or they use a program like Inspiration, again, where a structure has been imposed. But working memory is dynamic. Working memory is manipulating information, moving it around, reorganizing it, resequencing it, regrouping stuff. So working memory is dynamic. It's not static. So there's other things you can do with graphic organizer software, such as Inspiration. I'm going to use that as an example, so that I can take those processes in my head, put them out in front of me, and provide some sort of permanence to it. Because when that information is floating around in your head, it's kind of transient, all right? So anyway, so I'm going to go to app sharing here and show you some examples. Let's see, I'm going to pull up Inspiration. Let's see if this works properly. Okay, so Shannon, can you confirm we're looking at Inspiration here?
I am looking at it.
Okay. Okay, so what I'm looking at in the front screen here is a typical outline that a teacher might provide. Let's say if a student is reading the book Decay, which is commonly read in middle school. And so I have a framework here showing, you know, here are the 2 characters, here are the 2 themes, and there's lots of blank spaces for the student to fill in you know, the information as they're reading the book. Now, Inspiration is a graphic organizer, as the name implies, that has a graphic mode. So here's what that might look like as a concept map or a mind map, where a framework has been provided, and I can, you know, fill in that information. But again, like I said, working memory is dynamic, not static. Actually, let me just show you what this framework might look like if I filled it all in. So here's that same framework I was showing you, where the student has filled in information on the K. And if I show that in diagram mode, it looks like this. So, and again, some students are going to look at this and say, oh, the diagram makes much more sense so that I can see how everything is organized. And other students will say, you know, I'd really rather work in the text outline. So let's look at how this comes into play from the standpoint of planning a project. So this is an example of an actual project by a 5th grader who had 1 month to do this project. And very briefly, I've just summarized the assignment on the top here, was thoroughly research and explore of North America, summarize what you learned, and do that in various ways. You've got to produce a timeline, a map, a diorama, and an outline. And then you have 15 minutes to teach everything you learned to the class, and also give them a quiz. You have 1 month to do this. This is a really monumental project, and in this particular case, the student waited 2 weeks because they didn't even know where to start. So we sat down and we started looking at it and saying, all right, let's put the pieces out on paper here. So we have an oral presentation, we have a timeline, we have an outline of the explorer's life, and I've gone down and I've listed all these things, diorama, etc. And then, so what we're doing is we're thinking on paper, or in this case, thinking on the computer. And so then the subject came up of, well, what about sources of information? Well, we probably ought to do that first. So I'm just going to take sources of information. I'm going to drag that to the top of the list there. And so, so I asked the student, okay, so what are the sources you're going to look at? Well, I could go to the library. I could look at websites. All right, what websites are you going to look at? So what we're doing is we're breaking down, and you can see that what I'm doing is I'm in essence thinking out loud, thinking on paper here, and working out the parts, and what I'm producing is permanent, so the student can go back and look at this. In the interest of time here, I'm actually just going to expand all these different sections here to show you the sort of things that we talked about. And if nothing else, when you look at the web video of this later, you could look at it in detail, stop the video, to look at all the pieces that we did on this, and you know, figuring out what are the sources of information. You have to give an oral presentation. What tool am I going to use? Keynote, PowerPoint, maybe Inspiration itself. What are the parts I have to do? Well, I have to draft the presentation, then we're going to edit and finalize it. So the student is kind of thinking out on paper where they can refer to this, and then the last thing, in Inspiration, I'm going to turn on the checklist. So here I have a little check boxes beside everything so that I can check off things as I've done them. All right? So this can be a really good external working memory. So now I'm going to go back to Collaborate here. And, all right, so Shannon, are we back to the whiteboard now?
Yes, we are.
Okay, very good. Okay, so you'll see, especially with regard to accommodations for students, you'll hear it referred to as, well, we need to chunk the writing process, which essentially means breaking it down, the large project down into smaller chunks. The obvious reason to do that is to make it so it's less overwhelming. So you're tackling smaller parts individually rather than everything at once. As a matter of fact, a popular can't think of the word I'm looking for, but anyway, a popular approach is taken is called the POWER approach, P-O-W-E-R, which stands for plan, like brainstorming, then organize, then write, then edit, then revise. But the less obvious reason for breaking it down into parts is that each of those, to use that power thing as an example, each part of this writing process here, the brainstorming, organizing, writing, etc., requires different cognitive skills which tax the working memory in different ways. If you try to do all those things at once, like compose in your head and write it down on paper and check your spelling and make sure it's grammatically correct, you're really overloading the working memory. So what you want to do is you want to break it down so I'm only using certain cognitive skills at one time. So I'm essentially chunking you're isolating your cognitive skills that are needed to do each one of those tasks. Brainstorming, I don't care about spelling or organizing. I just need to get the ideas out of my head. When I'm organizing, I'm sequencing, grouping, etc. I still don't care about spelling. When I'm writing, now I'm going to pull on the language parts of my brain. But and so what you're doing is you're helping to minimize the burden on your working memory. Next slide. Okay, so let's see what we got here. So taking notes in class. Taking notes in class is a really big burden on working memory. If you think about it for a moment, you're taking in multiple types of information. You're looking at a board or whatever's projected at the front. You're listening to the teacher, perhaps listening to other students. You're writing down. You're perhaps reading a textbook or a handout. You're processing this information, deciding what's important, what's not, deciding what you want to write down. So now you have to activate your motor skills, whether it's typing or handwriting, and you have to do all this quickly enough so that you're not missing the next thing. It's a very demanding environment. So what usually happens is something has to give. Something doesn't get done. So one of the things that can help, this isn't technology specific, is the idea of providing a note-taking template. So rather than the student having to organize in their head, they've been provided with an organizational structure for this information beforehand in the form of a template. As I mentioned before about taking snapshots of things, if this is taking place in a class with an electronic whiteboard, it is possible to, very simple, for the teacher to just snap a screenshot of the board, and for that matter distribute it to the whole class so that you don't have to spend time writing stuff down. And again, this is appropriate in some cases and not in others. That's up to educators to decide. The other thing is, again, to minimize the amount of copying that's done, is to provide the student with a copy of a PDF of the slides and have them type on or annotate using software. For instance, if you're on a Mac, you can use the Preview app, which is built in, and use the annotation tools that are built into that. But another thing that you can do is also to supplement the notes with audio recording or with snapping pictures. And I'm going to talk about a couple of these things and a strategy that is helpful for that. So I'm going to move to the next slide here. So one popular tool that's used for note-taking, and everybody hears about it, is Livescribe smartpens. So a Livescribe pen, and on the left-hand side here you can see a picture of a Livescribe pen. Livescribe pen is kind of like a big fat pen. It has in the center section here that I'm circling, has a audio recorder and also speakers. So it's recording everything it hears. At the tip end, just behind the pinpoint, is a little infrared camera, and that camera is looking at a dot pattern on the special Livescribe microdot paper. It looks like random dots. It's actually a mathematical algorithm that tells the pen where it is on the page, and in which notebook. So what it's doing is it's looking at what you're writing, and it's recording your writing at the same time. So it's recording the audio, recording the writing, and it's linking the two things together. And this is an incredibly powerful tool when you think about that, is because what I can do, if the teacher said, here's your assignment for tomorrow, if I made a mark on the page at that point saying, here's where the teacher talks about the assignment, I can go back and listen to that. So what I'm going to do here is the easiest way for me to describe this is just let you see it. And what I'm going to do is go to YouTube.
This is the Echo Smart Pen from Livescribe. It's a computer and a pen, and it works like this. The Smart Pen starts recording everything you write and hear. Write notes during a meeting or lecture. Draw diagrams. Mark important information. To replay, just tap your notes and high-quality audio plays back from that exact moment. You can jump forward or go back to notes from days, months, even years ago.
All right, goals. Ready? Here we go.
The Echo Smart Pen connects to your PC or Mac computer by USB cable to transfer your notes and audio to Livescribe Desktop. After the transfer, Your digital notes and audio come to life as an interactive document called a pencast. Pencasts allow you to hear, see, and relive your notes exactly as they were recorded.
Or other small device.
To search your handwritten notes, type in any word. Livescribe Desktop searches for every place that word appears in your writing. Stay organized with custom notebooks by combining pages from different notebooks. Notes can be transcribed into typed text by downloading an app that's sold separately. You can even share your notes and audio as an interactive PDF, accessible by anyone with the latest Adobe Reader. The Echo Smart Pen. It's time your notes worked for you.
So anyway, there's 3 different models that was showing the Echo. There's also a thing called the Sky, where you can the Echo uploads your notes to a computer. The Sky uploads it to Evernote, which is an online digital notebook, and the new Livescribe 3, which just came out, will link to iPads, iPhones, and stuff like that. I'll forgo the pros and cons of each for the moment. The main takeaway from this is that you're recording audio, or you're recording your notes, and you're linking the two together. Now that's a keen parlor trick, but how do you leverage this to take advantage of that capability? So I'm going to move to the next slide, which is a strategy, and this is for use not only with the Livescribe pen, but for any note-taking apps like Audio Note or Notability, or a digital notebook like OneNote, which has audio recording capability that links audio and notes. The idea is to think about in advance what are the places you want to go back and listen to in your notes. If you've recorded a 1-hour class, you certainly don't want to go back and listen to the hour. It'll be just as cumbersome the second time around. You only want to go back to certain places. So pre-think what are those places you're going to want to go back to. For instance, teacher talks about an assignment or action item, or says this is going to be on the test. So have a shorthand for that. Teacher starts talking about assignment, you write an A with a circle around it. Main points or change in activity or topic, go ahead and write that out. If the teacher, like for instance, if you were taking notes with a Livescribe pen during this presentation, you could keep a running list of the slide number along the left-hand or right-hand margin so that you know where Shelley started talking about slide number 33 or something like that. And you could go back to that specific point in your notes. If you don't understand something or zoned out for a few minutes, have a symbol for that. So come up with abbreviated note-taking. I've actually used this quite successfully, this sort of strategy with students who are actually relatively dysgraphic, and the idea is I'm going to listen, I'm going to take a very limited number of written notes, but the notes I did take, I know exactly where I want to go back to because I pre-thought that before I started taking notes. Next slide. Okay, and as I mentioned before, the idea of quickly retrieving information from memory can often be a problem. The idea of having some place to retrieve that information quickly, like let's say I'm writing and I need vocabulary words, access to transition phrases, rather than trying to pull those out of memory, the easiest thing is to just have a word bank or a word list as a separate Word or Pages document next to the one you're writing in. So it's just a standard word list that you can refer to words, and for that matter even drag and drop them into your document. For more advanced stuff, you may want to use a digital notebook to retrieve anything from math formulas, examples of what a persuasive essay looks like, stuff like that. It's a lot easier than trying to retrieve that from your head. All right. So next we're going to go on, next slide, we're moving on to organizing materials and information. The key thing here is to make the organization system visual, and using color can be very important. Another key strategy is to have predefined a place for everything, and this is a place for physical items and a place for information, different types of information, and because it makes it easier for you to find stuff later. I'm going to talk primarily about digital notebooks and taking clippings from the web, and also smart folders on a computer. So moving on. Okay, so this is a little cartoon here, and I'll tell you why I put this in here after I finish reading it. So it's a two-panel cartoon, and on the first one it shows a guy holding a smartphone of some sort, and he's telling his friend, "I finally figured out how to manage my incoming data so that I'm not overwhelmed by information overload." And his friend says, "Cool, are you using decision support software or some kind of coherent organizational environment?" And on the second panel, the guy points to the phone and says, "No, there's just a little off button over here." And the reason I put this cartoon in here is because it shows a relationship between being very disorganized, being overloaded with information, and attention problems. Is that if you're overwhelmed and you don't have an organizational system, you can shut down. And that could look like an attention problem. It isn't really. I'd almost call it a defensive posture against information overload. So you just shut off. I'm not going to deal with any of this. But it's actually coming from an organizational problem. And it also makes a nice little cartoon for the... Anyway, so the first thing is to think about is to come up with a place for everything. So the first thing you're going to want to do is to have predefined, think of the things that you need to have predefined places for. It could be action items, appointments, reference info, papers that are going back and forth between, whether it's work and home or school and home. Fleeting thoughts and ideas. When you come up with an idea, do you have a place to write it down or to record it? And then I wanted to introduce something called the 6-second rule. The 6-second rule essentially says if I can't place that into some place, into where it needs to go in 6 seconds, it likely isn't going to get placed anywhere. It's going to go into the junk drawer of your mind or the junk drawer on your desk. This is especially important with regard to papers going to and from school. An accordion file is really easy to put papers into. You can just open up to the right place, stick the thing in there, and then move on. 3-ring binders, not so much. 3-ring binders take too much time. So what happens is the paper gets stuck into the front of the notebook instead. All right. The other thing that you just noted on the bottom, and this also applies to planning, is that you want to set aside dedicated time to organize and dedicated time for planning. And this is where some of that, some of those strategies come into play. Is you have to actually set it. It's not going to happen on its own. You have to actually put conscious effort into organizing and planning and do it on a regular basis. Next slide. All right, so here's an example of tools you can use to aid organization of papers and digital files. As I mentioned previously, the accordion file is a good thing. Put it in a backpack, and the other thing is don't classify things in that accordion file by, let's say, classes the student's taking. Instead, label them by context, like this needs to go home to show mom and dad. This I need to turn in first thing in the morning. So you're categorizing them by the context in which that information needs to be acted on. All right. So that's kind of a very important point, which I'll get to in a few slides here as well. From the standpoint of digital files, I mainly just wanted to point out, I'm going to be showing you digital notebooks and clippings, and also something called virtual folders that you may not be aware of on the computer. So next slide. Okay, so organizing files on the computer. Cloud drives, whether it's Google Drive, iCloud, Dropbox, Microsoft SkyDrive, these are great mainly because you have one place that you can access from a number of different locations, even a number of different computers. and it keeps down the number of multiple versions you have. For instance, if you're working on something at work or in school, and you put it on a USB drive, there are now 2 copies of that. The question becomes later, which one's the latest version? Did you make changes to one, not to the other? That can be very confusing. So by putting something in a cloud drive, that can help keep things organized, and obviously you want to set up folders in there as well. Many of the students I have one big folder on their computer called Documents, or on Windows, My Documents. And when they need to find something, they just use the search button, and they search for, assuming they knew what the file was called, they just search for it. And I've asked several of them, you don't have a folder system on your computer? And it's like, no, it's just easier to just type in the name of the document and search for it. Of course, most of them can't remember what they called the file, so it might take 2 or 3 minutes to find the file. Well, there's an interesting feature called virtual folders on both Mac and Windows computers that could be very handy. And when you do a search on your computer, you can save that search. All right, so it's called a saved search, and that saved search becomes what's called a virtual folder. And I have the instructions down for both Windows and Mac on the bullet points down here, so that, for instance, if I do a search for all files with the word algebra in the title, and I save that search, then when I create a new file that has the word algebra in the title, it immediately gets put into that folder. It's not a real folder, it's called a virtual folder, but without me having to do anything, just by naming it with that keyword, it automatically gets put in the search for algebra files folder, if that makes sense. All right? And so the main thing the student needs to do is to have a common naming protocol that they use. Like, okay, when I name my files, I'm always going to put down the name of the class first, and then the name of the topic for that class, and then put the date after it. All right? The next thing I wanted to show you was digital notebooks and clipping information. This is especially great for collecting information for research reports. Next slide. All right, so a digital notebook you can think of as being just like a spiral-bound notebook, but with the advantage that you can easily move around and rearrange your notes. You can annotate and tag them with keywords and do a really extensive search capability and saying, pull up all my notes that relate to this. And you obviously can't do that in a paper notebook. You can attach digital documents, images and video, and you can, just like I explained with the Livescribe pen, you can also record audio while taking notes and have it linked to the notes. So this could be for on the Mac. I would recommend Circus Pony's notebook. On a PC, probably Microsoft's OneNote. It's hard to beat that program. But this would be more for middle school on. I wouldn't use it for elementary school students, but especially high school and beyond. And it can be a good digital storage locker for just about everything you need to do. The other advantages is that these digital notebooks can be shared online with teachers or parents, so that instead of having to turn something in, you've given the teacher access to those notes, and you've essentially turned it in. But the thing I wanted to show you was the idea of clipping information from webs and documents. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. And I have a short video that I'm going to show you pretty quickly here of me clipping something from the web and dumping it onto dumping it into OneNote. And what's cool about it is it automatically retains a link to where it came from. So at bibliography time, this is just absolutely wonderful. Okay, so this is I'm looking in OneNote here, and you see I've got tabs at the top of my page here for my English class, my social studies class, algebra, and a tech report. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through some of the details in this video. So I created this video so that I could scroll through it and show people things. So there's my English class. So in social studies class, I'm annotating a page, a PDF. Math class, you'll notice I have a different background on the page. It's a grid work, and I'm actually typing math equations. And we're going to move on to the tech report. And then I'm going to insert something from a web page. I go up here and I say screen clipping. And this is my web page, and you'll see me just kind of dragging a section of the web page. Has to do with a OneNote 2013 preview. And then I dumped it onto, and I want to show you something here. I dumped it onto, all right, I apparently accidentally went back in the video. Sorry about that. Okay, so here I've dumped it onto the OneNote web page, but importantly, if you look at the bottom here, it retained a link to the original source. So when you're collecting information, you can say, send this to such and such page in my notebook, and there it is. And it's even retained a link to where it came from. So this can be, you know, amazing from the standpoint of keeping track of information and keeping it well organized. I wanted to give a kind of a shout out to one very popular online organization tool called Evernote. Its main claim to fame is that you can capture virtually anything digital from virtually any digital device, Mac, PC, your friend's browser, somebody else's smartphone, your email, and you can send it to your pre-organized set of notebooks in Evernote and then retrieve things based on some pretty robust search criteria. So they can be your information storage locker in the cloud that you can access from anywhere. And so anyway, it's a really cool tool. So moving to the next slide. So now we're going to talk about, and I am looking at the time. I know I have 19 minutes left here, so I'm just letting you know, Shannon, that I know, all right? So anyway, planning and sense of time. The biggest problem here sometimes is understanding the passage of time. So the first strategy is making time visible. We talked about some of that before, but it's important here too, is to make good use of timers. Another thing is to visualize the tasks and to chunk, as we've talked about before, chunk those tasks down into smaller parts and also chunk them by context, all right? And then one of the other things is to evaluate your use of time. So if you're making a plan for, here are the things that I'm going to do, jot down how long you think each one is going to take, then record how much time it actually takes, and then look at, okay, why do I think that is? Did I estimate poorly? Were there interruptions? And then make changes for next time. Because again, the goal for any of these executive function things is to come up with a decent strategy and to eventually internalize those strategies so that you can do them without thinking about them. So we're going to make good use of timers. I want to say something about digital calendars and then look at some different types of task management and task sequencing apps. So the first thing, we've mentioned this before, the idea of using a task timer. So I have that same image of the time timer on the side there. From the standpoint of keeping track of how long you've been at something, one of the hardest things to keep track of is how long have I been on the internet. If you use Firefox, there's an interesting extension called Time Tracker that you might be able to use. If we need to invoke the nuclear option, we might want to turn on parental controls on the computer, which more or less limit the amount of time that can be spent on the computer. And so let's see, talking about going down toward the bottom of the slide here, managing tasks and priorities. We've mentioned assignment calculator before about breaking down big projects into smaller tasks using that strategy. I want to say something about time management apps and also visual sequencing apps. I'm going to start off with the visual sequencing apps. Next slide. Okay, so for some people, and especially those who are very young, or maybe individuals who are on the spectrum, or for that matter, people who are elderly and have problems with executive function problems, having a visual task planner is very important. So I'm associating images with what I need to do. I've got two examples here on this slide. One is called Picture Planner, which works on the Mac in Windows or on iDevices. Second one is First Thin Visual Schedule, which is for mobile devices. In the first one, in the interest of time, I won't show you like a full version of this, but I do have the website on the bottom if you want to go to it, cognitopia.com. And what it provides is a visual planner where I see on the side here are my time slots, 8 to 8:30, 8:30 to 9, 10 to 11, whatever. And then I have columns for each of these with images in them of, okay, what is the activity? Where is the activity? Who does it involve? What do I need to bring? But this is all done with visuals, with icons and pictures, even videos for that matter. This can be very, very helpful for people who are going to be thinking non-verbally. The second one is a task sequencing app where what we're doing is we're breaking down tasks, like let's say morning routine or washing your hands or whatever, and we're breaking it down into a specific sequence of tasks where the person working with the individual using this can add their own pictures or videos. So you see here that, let's see, I've got on the side here, getting dressed, morning school routine, feeding the dogs or whatever. And then on the right-hand image, you see a two-step process. This is actually a video of a girl washing her hands. First item has been checked off. Second one isn't. I don't know how I'm touching this app if I'm washing my hands, though. I didn't think about that until just now. But anyway, that's from Good Karma Applications. You might want to check that out. So digital calendars and to-do apps, we're all, kind of familiar with that stuff. It has a digital calendar, obviously, has great advantages over a paper system, is that I can associate alarms and alerts, in essence prompts, so that, for instance, I have a couple of my students have a timer that goes off on their iPhone 5 minutes before class starts in the morning to remind them, here are the things you need to do before class starts. Did you remember to turn in your homework from last night? You need to talk to the teacher about some whatever. And, that obviously you can't do that with a paper planner, okay? So, most of us are familiar with digital calendars and to-do apps, and we're familiar with the advantages. Keep in mind that there's still place for paper planners, tying in that kinesthetic sense of writing it down can make a huge difference for some students. So don't always think that digital is better than paper. Sometimes paper can be better, but we need to make sure we ask that question. Another advantage of calendars is that they can be shared with other people who are helping to guide those strategies. But one of the disadvantages of just using calendars and reminder checklists, I'm going to go to the next slide, is the fact that it helps you know what you need to do, but it doesn't necessarily help you actually do it. A calendar doesn't in and of itself help you to prioritize your tasks. It doesn't manage your workflow or help you to use your time more effectively. So I'm going to mention 3 different strategies here for getting from to-do to done. And interestingly, all 3 of these strategies actually came from the corporate world and have since made their way down into use for students and for people individually. The first one, and there's almost a cult following for this, is called GTD, or Getting Things Done. It was popularized by Dr. David Allen at IBM. If you were to look up GTD apps, you will find, I'm sure, well over 100 of them on the App Store, on the iPad App Store. And there's a number of different parts to the GTD thing, but the main point that I want to bring up here is the idea of grouping tasks together by their context. In other words, by the skills or the context that you're using to complete the task. Like putting all your calls together, putting all things where you're working at the computer, all tasks that are only going to take you 5 minutes or less to do, all tasks that require you to be in a creative mode, creative mood. And then what you do when you need to sit down and do something is you do all those like tasks together. And if you're using a to-do, a task management app, and I've mentioned some at the bottom there, that use this strategy, what you do is you say pull up all the tasks that are in that context, and it will sort them out, and you'll have like a subset of those tasks. And the idea here is that tackling like tasks at the same time increases your efficiency and is less overwhelming. So I've listed some apps on the bottom here. Some of the most popular are Remember the Milk. That's a wonderful name for an app. Toodle-Do, Things, and one called Fire Task. And like I said, there are many, many, many of these apps out there that use this sort of strategy. Moving to the next slide. Priority matrix. Those of you who are familiar with Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, brings up something called a priority matrix. His son, Sean Covey, wrote a book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens, which is a very good book also. And so the priority matrix acknowledges that when you set a priority on something, why is it a high priority? There's actually 2 different parts to that. Is it a priority because it's urgent, or is it a priority because it's important? So for instance, my biology leaf collection that's due a month from now, that's half my grade, is a very important thing, but it's not due until a month from now, so it's not particularly urgent. However, the book report that is due tomorrow is I either get it done by tonight and get it in, or I don't do it at all. And it's only a small part of my grade, but it's urgent. If I'm going to act on it, I need to do it now. And it's recognizing there are actually 2 components to setting a priority on something. And I've got this table on the side here that lists it's a quadrant that has urgent and not urgent, and important and not important. So what you do is you classify your tasks by whether they're important and urgent, important and not important and urgent, or not important and not urgent. And like I said, this is used in the corporate environment. It's also used very successfully by students, and there is an app that does this. I've shown a picture of it at the bottom. It's called Priority Matrix. Make sure you get the one by Appfluence. The key point is that often we spend our time with the urgent, not important tasks. We waste all our time on that, and we don't give appropriate time to the important, that biology leaf collection, the important but not urgent tasks. And what happens is if we keep putting that off, then it becomes an important, urgent task, which is you're in crisis mode trying to get that done. So that's what we're trying to stay away from. Another one here is called, the third one was actually instituted by Toyota to make their production lines more efficient. It's called a Kanban, which apparently is Japanese for signboard. Very simple method, but the idea is to create 3 columns. You can do this on paper, on a whiteboard. There are apps that do this too. Where the first column is lists of things to do. The second column is what you're doing at this moment, and the third column is things you've gotten done. The key point is to make each task visual, so each like a sticky note. That's one sticky note per task, and to limit the amount of things you're doing at any given time. This may sound very simplistic, but it's actually quite effective. There's a picture of a girl in the bottom here with her own Kanban task board. She has 4 columns in her board. The first one is ready. This is a list of her columns are ready, set, go, and done. So ready is everything she has to do. Set is I'm prepared to do it, but I'm not working on it yet. Go is, this is the task I'm working on at this particular moment, and then finally done. There are actually some apps that make use of that sort of strategy. One called ConPlan for students. There's another one called FireTask, and I've listed a website that you may want to go to for more information. Okay, we've got 6 minutes left. I'm wrapping up here. The next sections are pretty quick here, fortunately. So self-regulation, probably the most important thing with regard to this, like I said, a huge overlap when you're regulating your impulses and emotional control and stuff like that. There's a huge overlap with ADHD here. But the key strategies is to pre-think your actions under certain circumstances, all right. And another one is to incorporate movement, all right, in order to self-regulate, because movement is very often used by kids, especially those with ADHD type attention, to it actually allows them to attend better if they can incorporate movement into what they're doing. So I'm going to move to the next slide here. This is a decision flow chart. Again, I could do this on paper, but I happen to do this in Inspiration. This is working with a student to pre-think, how do I introduce myself to play with other students? So I'm going to ask, can I play with you? And there are two possible branches. The answer is going to be either yes or no. If no, okay, I'm going to not be sad or angry, and I'm going to look for another group to play with. If yes, what will I do then? Well, I would ask what the rules are of the game. I either understand the rules or I don't understand the rules. So it's a way of visually mapping out what are my actions under certain circumstances and creating templates or scripts for that, which will eventually help the student to internalize that process. The next slide here, I've just shown a number of different tools for self-regulation that incorporate movement, fidget toys, inflatable seat cushion. Dandy sit-stand desk from Safco. You can look that up on Amazon, actually. It has a swing bar at the bottom here where students can swing their feet back and forth as much as they want, and it's guaranteed to be squeak-free. One of my students incorporated technology in an interesting way recently. He likes to pace while he's using speech recognition software, so he uses a Bluetooth headset and paces the room while dictating in using speech recognition. Okay, lastly, self-monitoring. So this is where you're checking on how am I doing on all this stuff. Visual checklists are important. I've got an example of one on the side here. Showing, this is typical, it says COPS, which stands for capitalization, overall look, punctuation, and spelling. And just to, check, okay, did I do all these things before I turn in my assignment? And then on the next slide here, I'm showing a thing called Rescue Time, which is a service you can sign into. There's a free version of it. You put this little app on your computer, Mac or Windows, and it auto-magically, that's the word they use on their website, tracks the websites you visit and the applications that you're using. Now, I realize in the wake of what's gone on with the NSA this last year, this might sound a little freaky, but it's not quite that bad, all right? And so what it's doing is it will track these things for you and then get back with you at the end of the week to give you a bird's eye view of, okay, what were the apps you spent your time on? What were the productive or distracting apps and websites you spent time on? And what were the ones that you didn't spend as much time on? And it increases the awareness of how time is spent to help the student to internalize better task management. And I shouldn't say student, actually it's for adults too. It's actually primarily used for employees. I must say that when I used it, it was a bit of an eye-opening experience. Like, wow, that's really where I'm spending my time? That's amazing. Okay, so last slide, more or less last slide. If anybody has any questions on this afterward, and I realize I raced through an awful lot of stuff here. If you have any questions, there's my contact info, and I'm always happy to entertain questions. afterwards.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for today's presentation. Unfortunately, we ran out of time for questions and answers, but feel free to email her at the email address on the website here, on the slide here, and let her know if you have any additional questions. Thank you so much for all for attending, and please remember when you exit, there will be a survey. Please take time to fill out the survey if you have a minute to. Just be really fast. It's only 4 to 5 questions, and just let us know what you're thinking so we can always improve our webinars. Thank you so much for coming. Bye.
All right. Thank you.